pull all this information together and perhaps to tell us what it means, Roger Moore will speak next. After getting his graduate degrees at Rice University, Roger founded the company that he's still heads, Moore Archeological Consulting. He's done a great many works, perhaps 500 projects, small and large altogether. And as I said before, his newest area of expertise is conflict archaeology, the kind of battleground archaeology that we've been seeing the evidence for today. Evidence is one thing, a narrative is another. And pulling together, using that historical imagination to make sense out of all of this fragmentary information is what really is at the end of this tale of archaeology and history pulled together. And I'm as anxious as you are to hear what Roger has to say about the project that is coming at least to the end of the first stage. Is that fair enough? Who knows where it's going to go beyond this, but please welcome archaeologist extraordinaire Roger Moore.
Thank you very much. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. We have been working, as you have heard, for quite some time at the broader San Jacinto site, and we've probably come up with some elements of new information as well as a lot of important artifacts from our earlier work. For example, I think we're well on the way to answering questions about the size and the munitions of the used in the Twin Sisters on the basis of the canister base plates. But our being able to work at the NRG site is perhaps the first occasion where we're able really to make an original contribution that parallels the historical record and firms up something that has been known for a long time, but perhaps misplaced, certainly nebulously placed. And we'll move along by addressing the first of Dr. Dimick's questions, and that was, why are these artifacts in a line? This illustrates all the battle-related artifacts recovered from the NRG tract. And you certainly don't have much of a hint of what's going on, of why they're in a line from the modern appearance of the tract, with the tangle of Chinese tallows and other Yopon and so forth that literally made it almost impossible for a metal detector to be used prior to the wood gator process, which is probably one reason why we found as many material as we did, because it became, within the last 30 or 40 years, it became essentially inaccessible due to the growth of Chinese tallows and other shrubs in what had previously been the edge of an open prairie. This illustrates the alignment along the 1944 USGS topographic map, and that begins to show one of the ways that we're able to use our historical imagination, although we cloak it in terms of hypothesis generation. And I specifically wanted to approach this site, as well as the rest of San Jacinto, first on the basis of the artifacts, what came out of the ground and its distribution and how it relates to its surroundings. So I began to think and discuss, kind of apart from but parallel to the historic record, what kind of event could take place that would result in a line of artifacts of this character, one that's about 180 yards wide by only 20 yards deep. And one of the things that comes to mind is that a line of soldiers either in a long file or standing abreast. But then why are they dropping all their military goods at one time in this position? And then again, still taking the environmental and archaeological view of things, we turn to what Jeff discussed earlier, the landscape, the natural landscape. And we find through the GIS process that using of these old maps overlaying in their true geographic position, that the alignment of artifacts is at the edge of a gully, and that the gully was one of the few places with trees in the area. You had trees along Boggy Bayou and along the shoreline, and this smaller gully, which extended to the southwest from Peggy Lake, was also naturally wooded. And of course, I'll end this kind of polite fiction of ignoring the historical artifacts for the sake of cogitating about the historical record for the sake of cogitating about what's there, and admit that at the same time, of course, that we were thinking about, could a surrender produce these sorts of things, or what kind of other human activity associated with the battle would create a linear alignment of artifacts. We started to look seriously at the historical record to see what kind of event recorded historically might result in the dispersion of artifacts like we see in the field. And we became better and better aware, of course, of the Almonte surrender of a group of 200 to 400 men that is at some point ambiguously placed. Oh, here's another diagram of individual artifacts, and back to one of Dr. Dimick's questions, the clusters of musket balls, and I think they are very, very useful in this instance as an indication of individual soldiers dropping multiple bundles of cartridges, perhaps held in fabric bags or something like that, that would not have the buckles that we find are startlingly absent. I am drawing from Manuel's lecture that we shouldn't certainly expect Mexican Army insignia and so forth to be GI in the American sense, any kind of high degree of standardization. They might be using the same design themes, but there's going to be a lot more hand craftsmanship and variation in the execution of things, ranging from those grenadier badges to cartridge buckles. We find that that the artifacts and the historical record seems to come closest to matching the accounts of the surrender of Juan Almonte, and I would refer to you to that cover illustrations on your program. I would have included that in the slideshow, but I got distracted by the belated visit from a Chronicle reporter yesterday afternoon and never got around to it, got back to it. You've got to think about the situation that these troops were in at that moment in time. They've escaped the immediate carnage of the battle, and we know that they're fleeing some of them are fleeing off to the southeast. We can tell, we've got evidence for that in the scattered artifacts that we found along Peggy Lake. But at that point in time, they're still in the stage of being a disorganized, fleeing mob. And they're going to be pursued at some point by the mass of the Texans who are still preoccupied back at Boggy Bayou, finishing off a lot of their companions. So choosing, a good commander always looks at the landscape, and in this case, it's not a landscape of choice. It's a landscape that's dictated by the circumstance of this retreat, and it wasn't chosen in advance. We can agree that it would take a commander with an extraordinary cool head to keep his wits and assert command over a large group of soldiers who had managed to escape the onslaught of the enraged Texans following the slaughter at Boggy Bayou. This hodgepodge of troops was a mixture of Mexican units, and they're making their way across the prairie. But who and what kept them from being ridden down and killed? At least one Mexican officer rose to this challenge late in that fateful day. While we believe that we know his identity, we have abundant and unambiguous physical evidence of his presence of mind and that of all the soldiers who followed his command. Obviously, I'm reverting to my written script since I'm not doing so well as off the cuff. But the resourceful officer recognized a place where the fleeing troops could be concealed long enough for a short respite from Texan pursuit, a pause that was sufficient to impose military discipline and turn the troops' helpless flight into an orderly capitulation. This act of command probably saved most of their lives, since scattered infantrymen in desperate flight have been nothing better than lambs for the slaughter for mounted cavalry since the time of Alexander. The commander managed to gather several hundred troops, organize them into a solid rank about 180 yards wide and at least a couple of soldiers deep, and commanded them to lay down their remaining arms and march out of the cover of the woods as a solid front to the scatter of a few Texas cavalrymen who were poised to attack in the prairie to the southeast. He knew that no matter how strong these Texans' lust for vengeance might be, they would realize that they had no choice but to accept the surrender of such a large and well-organized group. And what accident of topography made that commander's accomplishment possible, or at least much easier? The line of artifacts which we found coincided with the edge of a grove of trees next to a shallow gully appearing on historical maps and aerial photographs. This marks where several hundred Mexican soldiers, sheltered by the trees and organized by Colonel Juan Almonte, employed discipline to force the Texans to accept a surrender with dignity. This event was noted in the historical record, but was located incorrectly in some accounts, including the memories of the aged Texas veterans who journeyed to mark the actual location of battle events in the 1890s. Some of the variation in the historical accounts are depicted in this map. Of course, there's the marker for the surrender is just on the southeast side of Boggy Bayou, but there's accounts ranging up to this radius around the center of the battlefield. That's 3 miles away from the site of the battle. Whoops. But here we have the red line is about 1.5 miles away, and that depicts the actual distance from the center of the battlefield to, pardon? Blue line? Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, blue line with red dots there is the radius to the discovery on the energy tract, and it's about 1.5 miles from the battle. We've already seen a lot of the artifacts before, but one of the things they bring home to us is that it was a mixture of troops. We probably got some, maybe majority of infantry, some cavalry and so forth, but the officers and non-coms who were present were able to bring together what was a rather disorganized and group of men fleeing piecemeal across an open prairie, where again they could be picked off by cavalry with sabers with ease, and form them up again into a disciplined unit that could achieve a surrender that would not only preserve a little bit of their dignity, but also probably save their lives. So yeah, I think this event was the best possible end to what was otherwise a terrible day for the Mexican army. So, thank you.
We're going to have a few moments for off-the-cuff questions. One thing that should be pointed out for those of you who might not know is that Juan Almonte was perfectly fluent in English, which I think is fairly important in shouting the desire to surrender at the opportune moment. Almonte was educated in New Orleans and was fluent in English and French as well as Spanish, and is well known during the Revolution to have used his command of the vernacular English to fool more than one person into thinking that maybe the Mexicans weren't next door but someone else. Do we have any very quick questions before we take our break? Yes, sir.
How deep beneath the surface were you finding these artifacts?
How deep beneath the surface were you finding these artifacts?
Mostly a foot or less. Are these on? Yeah. Mostly a foot or less. A lot of them were just a matter of several inches. One thing that sometimes limits is the strength of the metal detectors, so we're not guaranteeing that there isn't anything deeper, but we have fairly good metal detectors. I think the deepest things we found were about 30 centimeters, if I'm not mistaken.
And we might add that in the case of the NRG tract, since the archaeology division...
Roger, for the sake of the DVD, would you come over here?
And I might add that in the case of the NRG tract, since the Archaeology Division of the Texas Historical Commission, under the direction of Jim Bruseth and Mark Denton, brought their magnetometer to the site, we have a good degree of confirmation that we got all the ferrous, all the iron artifacts out, since we seem to have their results were negative, indicating that we had found everything that was there to find.
One last question before we break. Yes, ma'am, back in the back. NRG, which I discovered was a sort of a magic way of saying energy, is the name of the company who owns the tract of land and whose executives were given the award at lunch today. And it stands for?
I asked that very question at lunch today, and there are a number of myths and mysteries according to their own PR people. Energy is one, non-regulated generation was another, and that's somewhat of a inside energy joke, energy, NRG. Anyway, so I guess it doesn't really stand for anything specific. It's just the company's name.
15 minutes seems like a pretty good amount of time for a break, rather than the 10 minutes that's on your official schedule. We will still get back and start at 4 o'clock. If you want to have any written questions submitted, bring them up here and put them on the podium. And we will, first of all, before you do anything else, let this group know how much you appreciate the hard work they've done. Thank you. And if you, yeah,
Hang on just a second.
they've decided to say something in return.
Something that Dr. Demick pointed out to me I should have done and will now take the opportunity to do. I'd like to ask everyone who volunteered out of either the energy project or the other earlier work to please stand up and be acknowledged.
Come on, guys.
What first led you to the NRG site and when? Are there plans to continue further exploration? And I'll save some of the other questions for later, but what led you first to the site?
What led us to the site is what anthropologists would call informants, and what folklorists might call legend. Anyway, the word was brought to us that over the years artifacts related to the battle had been found in that general vicinity. Of course, we had no idea exactly where, and because the tract was so thickly vegetated, we were not at all confident that we could be successful in finding them, especially if they were as scattered as they were along Peggy Lake. But thanks to a combination of luck and a reasonably well-designed sample scheme, we hit that concentration twice and made in our transects, our initial transects, and that made it, everything went from that point upward in the way we feel about it. There probably is some more work to be done to make sure that we followed the concentration out completely. It was mentioned that some of the that the high power lines would have interfered with the metal detectors on one edge of the concentration, and we may be able to find some technological fix for that problem to find out whether the material really extends that way. And of course, the deciding factor, there are two deciding factors. One is that we continue to remain in NRG's good graces, and one way to help that happen is for everyone to continue to respect their private property rights by staying off the land, which is fenced and patrolled by the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. And the other way is through continued funding for the overall the archaeology and the overall restoration of the park, which is handled through the Friends of the San Jacinto Battleground Association, the Friends group for the park, and the sponsors of the symposium.
Roger, if you'll stay at the mic, there's a quick follow-up since you spoke directly to the Almonte surrender hypothesis. One patron asked, where can one find written references to Almonte's surrender?
I'll let, do you have it?
Sure. As far as where, it's a mixture of sources. I found some in the quarterly of the Texas State Historical Association.
That narrows it down to about 100 years.
I know, it's a volume 4, number 4, April 1901.
That's better.
There was one from the annual publications of the Historical Society of Southern California, of all places, which is, I'm sorry?
Just read,
Yeah.
have a sentence or two of the
Well, in that case, this one says, Almonte, finding all was lost and fearing all would be cut to pieces, placed himself at the head of 300 or 400 men, formed them into a column 4 or 8 deep, 4 or 8, I don't know, and threw down their arms, and then held up the white flag and surrendered them at once to a small body of troops who were in pursuit, and they all marched into camp together. So that's one source. R.J. Calder has an account where he talks about Colonel Almonte's halt, let's see, just before the sunset, the pursuit and massacre was brought to a sudden stand by Colonel Almonte's halting the terrified Mexicans in a solid body or column and making a formal surrender. Pedro Delgado has some discussion that led us in the right direction. The Journal of Nicholas Labadie, also Stephen Sparks' account. He's the one who says that Almonte surrendered 3 miles away from where the battle occurred. Amasa Turner has some surprisingly detailed, if not precisely accurate, distances that he describes as to where the surrender occurred. And then just more recently, I don't have it in this one, but we found a source that said 2 miles. And all of those distances, our site falls within a in-between space between them. So it's multiple sources, and it was just a lot of historical research.
Just a quick follow-up for Sam Haynes. Could you expand briefly on something called the theory of oppression, a term that was used?
I was asked that after my talk, and I haven't had a chance to take a look at that citation. But whoever asked me that question, I'll give you my email after the session here, and I'll send it to you. Okay.
This is a question asked by 2 people. What effect has subsidence had on the investigation and searching for artifacts? I guess that's another way of saying what might be underwater.
I'll go ahead and take that one. The San Jacinto is exactly ground zero for the greatest subsidence in the Houston-Galveston area. Texas Parks and Wildlife, our water folks and our geologists have been studying this for a number of years and have determined that we've lost anywhere between 8 and 10 feet in elevation at San Jacinto. Boggy Bayou itself is probably the biggest evidence of that. Some of the maps that you saw earlier show Boggy Bayou as a very wide landscape feature, which today is simply water-filled. We did a remote sensing study out there, and I've been out on Boggy Bayou myself in a boat with just a long stick. And until 1985, there was a road that went from one side to the other. We found it at a depth of 6 feet with approximately 2.5 feet of silt on top of it. That road was placed there, I believe, in the 30s, and after 50 years, it went underwater, and after another 25 years or so, it is so far underwater that it's got 2.5 feet of more material on top of it. So what is still out there that may be underwater is probably mostly in the Boggy Bayou area. The Texan camp now has levees to keep that area from going underwater. So rather than being underwater, the evidence there may have either been filled over top of by the levee up against Buffalo Bayou, or may even have been cut as the stream widened itself there. Other parts of the battleground itself are high up enough that the battleground proper, the 1,200 acres that Parks and Wildlife manages, that's not gone under, although the Peggy Lake area, that entire channel has changed, and Peggy Lake no longer exists. It's now known as the Peggy Lake Fill area. It's essentially a dumping grounds for the Houston Ship Channel. So everything on that side and the marsh along that side, along the San Jacinto, not along Buffalo Bayou, but on the east side, that has either gone underwater or is gone under as much as perhaps 9 feet of fill. What we might or might not have been able to find there would have been the number of soldiers who were killed as they tried to get across those marshes, and as they hit the deeper water and the mud, the Texans were mowing them down, and you can read that in any of the documents. We'll probably never see any of that evidence archaeologically.
Here's a question which I'll try to answer myself. Did General Gaines' soldiers help Sam Houston whip the Mexicans at San Jacinto? And the answer is almost certainly yes, as those who were regular annual attendees to the symposium. I believe, Bill, and I believe it's Marjorie Walraven. Have I got the name right? Bill and Marjorie Walraven have extensively investigated this and have identified perhaps as many as 200 so-called deserters from the United States Army, many of whom brought their own bayonets across the line from Louisiana to Texas. There were almost certainly United States soldiers, some of whom went back to the United States Army, some of which decided to stay in Texas. And you don't find their bayonets on the battlefield because they lived and kept them. But yes, and the Walravens have written that up in an article, I think about 3 or 4 years ago in the Southwestern Historical Quarterly. But if you'll search the article by the Walravens in the Quarterly, you'll definitely find the answer to that. Here's an interesting question. How does one become an archaeological volunteer?
Well, we've got 2 sorts of volunteers that have been working with us. The metal detectorist, that awkward term that we coined and imposed on Dr. Dimick and his crew, and people who are avocational archaeologists whose interest can be not more extensive, but broader, because they probably are interested in prehistoric Indian sites as well as historic period sites. And those folks are members of the Texas Archaeological Society, which has various chapters around the state, including large ones in Houston and in Fort Bend County. And then more narrowly within the group of avocational archaeologists, there's the members of the Office of the State Archaeologist Archaeological Stewards Network. These are people who have had additional training and are certified by the state to act as kind of agents for the historical commission out in various regions spread all the way all across Texas. When the THC gets calls about something eroding out of a creek or hit by a road construction, they call on the stewards to go out and look at these things and evaluate them because they're on the scene and they can respond quickly. Most of our avocational archaeologists, people have been archaeological stewards or people in, similar people in the Houston or Fort Bend archaeological societies. And then Dr. Dimick has coordinated the whole metal detectorist volunteer effort. So defer to him in describing the criteria of that. But of course, one of the basic ones is that they have to work a lot more slowly than they're used to because they have to go along with us picky archaeologists who have to plot in all the finds and dig everything, and which includes, of course, when we're back in the park, an amazing number of tab tops and other pieces of junk and aluminum cans. That was one of the nicest things about working in the NRG tract. It's been, private property for so long that there was very little in the way of modern debris there.
One thing I'd like to oh, I'm sorry, Rod. One thing I'd like to point out, even though this may sound a bit elitist, is that because of the nature of this project, when we're on the state lands, we're doing everything under an antiquities permit to Parks and Wildlife or Rogers Company. And the volunteers that we use are all trained. We don't take anybody in who hasn't had any archaeological training. They must know archaeological techniques for a number of reasons, but the most important being that the artifacts that you're seeing here If they are hit in being taken out of the ground by a shovel, we can destroy them. Understanding the way these machines operate, why the way the metal detectorists, those individual people operating a metal detector operate, the specific information that we are looking for as those objects come out of the ground, that's done through a very specific set of protocols that everybody that works on this project understands. So I don't want to disimbue anybody of trying to become a volunteer, but you do need to go through the training with the Archaeological Stewards Program with the Historical Commission or the Texas Archaeological Society in order to become one of our volunteers. And despite that, the only people up here that are being paid to do that are Roger and Douglas. We have a huge contingent of people who do that, and yet despite the fact that the only two people paid, we have two of the best experts in the world, in Manuel and Greg Dimmick, in these types of artifacts. And that just shows the amount of time and effort that they have personally put into this.
Don't forget that Doug did his work for free.
Right, and Doug Scott did his work for free because he's just very interested in it.
But let me say that if you are interested in becoming an archaeological volunteer, the best route to begin that process is through one of the local chapters of the Texas Archaeological Society. Check in your community and see if there is one nearby. And of course, if you live in the Houston area, I've mentioned that there are several in this area.
And the best route to go home if you're leaving here today is not to go down Spur 5 to I-45 because it's now underwater. So you might want to go Elgin or some other route away, but you know how low it gets down there as you turn around and get on 45 from Spur 5 as you leave the University of Houston. You might want to give the water a little time to drain. As Dave Britton reminded me yesterday that I went to school at William Rice's Marsh. And there's a certain flatness to this territory that makes rain a problem. Let me ask the next question of Sam Haynes. This is a question that he addressed to a certain extent when I heard him give a talk recently. Was Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar for or against the annexation of Texas to the United States?
Well, I'm sure you're referring to the second annexation attempt, not the first. The first annexation attempt he was obviously opposed to. Texas nationalism, as he understood it, was based on this desire to protect, as he said, our peculiar interests, and that meant slavery. And in the 1830s, of course, slavery was under attack in the United States, in the northern states. And in 1845, he was in Georgia, and he came back to Texas, and he had the not only did he campaign for annexation, but he also had the temerity to say that he had been for annexation all along, which made absolutely no sense whatsoever. But his reasoning did make some sense. In 1845, the reason he's for annexation is because he believes that there is now a greater threat to Texas slaveholders. Not only is there a greater threat to Texas slaveholders, but a greater threat to Southern slaveholders. And it's not William Lloyd Garrison, and it's not the Boston, the New England Anti-Slavery Society. It's Great Britain. After the Emancipation Act of 1833, and this fear that Great Britain might actually might try to make Texas a client state of the British Empire, this had really given Mirabeau Lamar, like a lot of other Southern slaveholders, like John C. Calhoun, real pause and real grounds for concern. So in both cases, he was opposed to annexation initially because he wanted to protect slavery in Texas, but he supported it in 1845 for the very same reason.
Can I add to that? Lamar also had an ulterior motive because in the claims for the Republic of Texas, he had deferred $10,000 of his salary as president and did not draw it and just left it in the Treasury. And when Sam Houston followed him, refused to authorize the payment to Lamar. So when Texas was annexed to the United States, Lamar was a creditor for his $10,000 as president. He had never yet collected, and they thought that annexation of the United States would give them their best shot at being paid.
And did he get paid?
You'll have to find the end of the book, and it's like giving you the hair. It's like giving you the end of Harry Potter.
And I remember Sam reading in one of Lamar's correspondence when he was president of the Texas Republic, he got a letter from the Deep South saying that I hope you'll hold fast to Texas independence so that the southern states can join you when they leave the Union. This was the talk that was going on in the 1830s when, late 30s, early 40s when Lamar was president. So it is a mistake always to forget that slavery is very much a part of what's going on in Texas. When the Civil War began, 1 out of every 3 Texans was a slave. Slavery is a very important part of the diplomatic history of the Texas Republic as well as the political history. It's very often in the background and it's not talked about in the textbooks, but you ignore it at your peril. Let me ask another question, which I think is going to be very interesting to everyone here. What will be the final disposition of the artifacts from the NRG site?
NRG has graciously given Texas Parks and Wildlife ownership of those artifacts. I can't say enough about the stewardship of that company. They've been traded a couple of times. They've got new owners, new presidents and everything, yet the people that we are working with there are absolutely fabulous and have said, look, this is important. This needs to go to somebody who can steward those artifacts. So my archaeology lab in Austin will have those artifacts. We hope to see them displayed in a visitor center that, as you heard earlier, will be constructed somewhere on the battleground in the next several years. The information, the lessons that we're learning about both the NRG tract and the areas inside the battleground proper are all wrapped up in those artifacts. So that lesson for the teachers bringing their children there and for anybody coming from, pick a state, those artifacts are a main part of that story. So we'll be displaying some of them.
And
You might want to mention the 5 of the artifacts, 5 or 6 of the artifacts from the Mexican camp are going to be displayed at the Sam Houston Memorial Museum in Huntsville for the next year. So those are from the previous digs, but they're still very exciting artifacts.
And a very important aspect of getting the information out on the NRG tract, we have both as a professional and really a contractual obligation under the National Park Service Battlefield Protection Grant. We will submit a final report on all the work we've done there. We've already submitted a draft, but it did not include this last phase of the investigation. So we will revise that draft to include the swath area, the major removal of the trees and the final artifacts that were recovered in that. And that document will be published in a manner specified by the Park Service as part of the grant.
Well, we've been swinging back and forth here between the macro and the micro. Let's go back to the macro again. And I know that this set of 3 questions is by a teacher, if not a professor. Please discuss the following events. I make out tests like that sometimes. And I'll try to take the first one. Sam Houston's maneuver of the Texan Army into the territory between the Neches and the Sabine River. One of our speakers has already referred to Andrew Jackson's peculiar view of the Texas boundary with the United States, or the Mexican-Texan boundary with the United States. There's a really interesting letter that Sam Houston wrote during his retreat to his friends in Nacogdoches. I don't remember if it was to Anna Regay or her father, but he says, remember that Old Hickory claims the Neches as the American boundary. That's west of Nacogdoches. And he says, don't worry about anything happening to you as long as you stay in Nacogdoches. My late friend Tom Lindley, and also my late enemy Tom Lindley, we had a kind of love-hate relationship, as did many of Tom's friends. Tom Lindley found evidence of close correspondence, couriers going back and forth between Sam Houston during his retreat and Fort Jessup on the American side. Couriers, people claiming their bounties, not their bounties, but their compensation for going back and forth as couriers between Houston's army. And also there's that curious period of February 1836, where according to most Houston biographers, he's negotiating with the Cherokee. Well, he didn't need to negotiate with them for a month. There's very good evidence that he's in East Texas and in contact with the American army at Fort Jessup. With regard to the last maneuver, I know some people have alluded already today to the, without mentioning it, to the Whichway Tree, where Sam Houston decides perhaps to follow his army, perhaps not, down towards San Jacinto. Look, Sam Houston didn't decide that day to go to San Jacinto, no matter what Dennis Quaid wanted to dream about in that movie. And most people, many very good historians, have made the mistake of thinking that Sam Houston crossed over at Harrisburg, across Buffalo Bayou, because there are things dated from Harrisburg, but they're on the north side of the bayou. And Sam Houston continued to go east along the north side of the Buffalo Bayou, on the opposite side from where San Jacinto is, from where the battleground now is, until they got word from captured Mexican couriers as to exactly where Santa Anna was. A courier with William Barrett Travis's saddlebags was caught and delivered to Houston, and he knew, because of those letters back and forth between the Mexican army, that Santa Anna was out there with a corporal's guard, a kind of rapid movement to go out and try to catch those Mexican politicians that we heard about today from Jim Bevel. I'm sorry, the Texan politicians, Lorenzo de Zavala, David Burnett, the others. It's only when he got that news of where Santa Anna was and how few men he had with him that he ordered the destruction of a farmhouse on the north side of Buffalo Bayou. Now, why? I like to ask audience questions. Why did he destroy that farmhouse?
So it could make a raft out of the floor.
So he could make a raft out of the floor.
Get the artillery across
They had
the line.
hardwood floors in that farmhouse, and he took a long time to ferry not only the artillery, those two cannon, but also many of the men across Buffalo Bayou. It was a lengthy operation to cross Buffalo Bayou east of Harrisburg, and in many ways that's when the die was cast, because now he's on the south side. And now he's going to have to meet up with Santa Anna. And now he's making that run to Lynchburg, or at least to Lynch's Ferry. But the critical move, in my opinion, is not which direction they went at the fork of the road between Nacogdoches and down towards Harrisburg. He never went to Harrisburg. He stayed north of the bayou until he found out where Santa Anna's army was, and then he crossed. And that seems to me the critical decision in Sam Houston's campaign, to cross over where, if caught by Santa Anna, he cannot easily cross over again. It's do or die after they cross Buffalo Bayou. Let me ask another question. Obviously, Mexico lost, and I want Greg Dimmick perhaps to address this one. Obviously, Mexico lost the battle against Texas at San Jacinto. What happened to all the cannons, rifles, and other military equipment that the Mexican army had with them?
Well, I don't think it's obvious that the Mexican army lost the Texas Revolution at San Jacinto. You got to read my book, Sea of Mud. There were still 4,000 Mexican soldiers in Texas. The Sea of Mud was another blow to them, but it was obviously a huge strike won against them. San Jacinto was. Most of the stuff that was captured, and there's somebody here that knows more about it than I do, but I'll do a good job of, I think, of summarizing it for him. Joe Hudgens has excavated post-West Bernard with the Houston Archeological Society, and that was a Republic of Texas gun repair armory type thing, and it was on the West Bernard River in what's now Wharton County, and they were there for a year and a half or 2 years repairing a lot of guns. Most of them seem to be Mexican guns. I believe they set up an armory in Houston, and I don't know whether that was before or after post-West Bernard, but the Texans took those guns, they used them in their army, they repaired them at that armory, they stored them at Houston and at post-West Bernard. They had a cannon there. The one cannon that the Mexican army had there at San Jacinto, it's a good question what happened to that one. There is one document that says that a Texan ship was captured. I don't remember the name of it. I know that William Wharton was on it because he was a captive of the Mexicans in about 1837. There's a document that says on that ship was a bronze cannon that had a plaque on it that said it was captured at San Jacinto. So it's possible that's where the Golden Standard, what happened to it. Talk with Jeff Dunn about whether it was ever called the Golden Standard. There's a lot of doubt about that.
Here's one from Manuel Hinojosa. Is the preserved cloth with copper or cupric residue the remains of uniform filigree? If so, does that indicate the presence or remains of an officer or of an elite soldier like dragoon?
Well, I think that answer to that question is going to be, it's going to come out when some lab investigates it. But my guess on something like that is that the material seems to be a finer cloth, and it evidently had structure in it that probably would come in from more of an elite group. Keep in mind, your infantry soldier was a grunt. He was very simply dressed, and the only ones that would have that fine cloth would have been an officer or a cavalryman, because cavalrymen usually, if you had a horse, you were in the cavalry, and a lot of your horse people were hacienda people. So to answer the question, I think it'd more likely it'd be an elite soldier or officer.
Here's one where I don't know the answer. I don't know if anybody else in the room does, but I ought to know the answer, and I'm not sure. Is Sam Houston known to have visited the Alamo site after the Revolution? Does anyone know? Anyone know if Sam Houston is known to have visited the Alamo site? I simply don't know. I think that later on, I think his signature, I think, on some of the books at the Meeker Hotel. He made in the 1850s. I don't know. 2036, 1850. What's the building date of the Meeker Hotel? I would be very surprised. I would be very surprised if in his career as United States Senator and then later Governor of Texas, he never visited San Antonio again. And if he were in San Antonio, I would be extremely surprised if he did not visit the Alamo site, whether or not he wanted to blow it up. Here's a good question. Can we use the GM63, is that the right term? Can we use the EM63 to find the twin sisters?
I'll try. My best guess would be no. Dr. Everett has used the machine on, he mostly uses it on places where they know something is. It's much harder to use the machine in a purely exploratory mode. So unless we have a really good idea of where the twin sisters are to begin with, at least the general location, I don't know that would be that useful. Best I can do.
Here's one for James K. Polk's biographer. Discuss the following event. James Knox Polk's 1846 American Blood Has Been Shed on American Soil address to Congress.
Discuss it in what way? I'm not sure. What I can say about it, it was clearly disingenuous. I don't think American blood had been spilled on American soil. I think Lincoln was right in asking him to, when he proposed the spot resolution, to name the exact spot where American blood had in fact been shed. I would say that. Polk's position on the boundary is a very interesting one. If you go back and you look at the campaign, when he's campaigning for the presidency, he says on many occasions, because this was an important issue many Americans realized, that the Mexican claim was a very good one. And compensation for Mexico is something that he is very much in favor of and supports. He is on the record supporting compensation for Mexico in the campaign of 1844. But once he becomes president, then he suddenly changes his mind. Now, why he changes his mind is anybody's guess. But by 1846, in fact, long before that, by 1845, shortly after the inaugural, he is absolutely convinced that the Rio Grande is the legitimate boundary of Texas. He basically takes the Texas view at face value, and no longer is he talking about compensation. Now, he sends Slidell to Mexico to dangle some money in front of Mexican leaders, but he doesn't really believe that they have any right to that, any right to compensation. He is assuming that the Rio Grande has always been the Texas boundary, and therefore is the American boundary after annexation.
Thank you, Sam. By the way, Texas claimed that the Rio Grande was the boundary all the way to its source. Obviously, baloney. This includes Santa Fe, the capital of New Mexico. If Laredo was part of Texas, then so was Santa Fe. That must mean Laredo isn't part of Texas. The Nueces had always been the boundary. Sam Houston had to veto a bill the Texan Congress passed, making the Pacific Ocean the boundary of Texas. So those of you who see the Rio Grande River as the boundary of American soil are simply buying propaganda. It was disputed, but Mexico had the better claim. I think that's fairly obvious.
No, yeah, I think Jim is exactly right. And one of the things that always bothers me in Texas textbooks, history textbooks, and American history textbooks, is that it's such a complicated issue that they just simply say, well, it's a disputed boundary, and they leave it at that. And that doesn't really do it justice, because that sort of assumes that both sides have the equally good claims. And Jim's right. The Mexican claim is much better, in my view.
That is, Texas, not the Mexican claim to Texas, but the Mexican claim to the Texan claims that went beyond Texas. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the Trans-Nueces and the Upper Rio Grande. That's not part of Texas, never had been. And don't forget that not only did the feds build the San Jacinto Monument, they also drew the boundary for western Texas. Congress did that, the United States Congress, not the Texans. Here's a question. There's a dead silence out there as I speak heresy. What percent of Mexican musket balls were made of lead, and what percent of copper? Were there any copper musket balls found at San Jacinto?
We have not yet found any copper musket balls. Now, the very thought of a copper musket ball may sound strange to some of you, but copper was such an abundant byproduct of the silver mining in Mexico that it was used for unconventional purposes. But the one about which we know the most is for artillery projectiles from Dr. Dimick's finds at the Sea of Mud, which he can describe in greater detail, and some recent finds in for example, the first tiny bit of work for the prairie restoration, where we recovered a copper canister shot within the park.
As far as copper musket balls, we have as far as I know, the only person here that's found copper musket balls, the only one I know of, is Terry Keeler. Terry, stand up for a second. Terry has moved to St. Louis, but he's come back for this. As far as I know, he found 3 or 4 copper musket balls in the Sea of Mud. I don't know why I never found any of them. But we found several hundred musket balls, and we found 3 or 4 copper shot. Interestingly enough, that the United States the Americans were convinced that copper was poisonous, and you were evil and vile and just Satan if you used copper shot, because the person was going to die even if it was a minor wound. The Americans were more civilized. They used lead, and that can't hurt you.
Yeah, Herman Ehrenberg's memoir says exactly that, and of course we know that was exactly wrong. But correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Dimick, but there is a reaction, a chemical reaction between blood and copper, which can produce irritation. Irritation, which may make some people think that the copper is poison, but we know that lead is the more deadly of the two.
Yeah.
Here's a question. Was General Coss killed at the Battle of San Jacinto? No, he was not. And he was one of the VIPOWs. Can you figure that one out? Well, along with Santana and Almonte and others. He's a VIPOW. Manuel Hinojosa talked about a Mexican cavalry helmet. This may have to be the last question. I'm sorry if we can't get to. Oh, let me ask one more because it's important. If we want to contribute to the archaeological work at San Jacinto, sponsored by the Friends of San Jacinto, how do we make out the check? Who do we give it to? Say that again. And should they mark on the check or support archaeological work? Yeah. Did you hear that? Make your check directly to me. No. Make your check to the Friends of the San Jacinto Battleground and indicate in the detail line that it is to support archaeological work. And then the last question, I'm afraid, is for Manuel Hinojosa. In speaking to the Mexican cavalry helmets, you suggested that the style dates from colonial times. What era do you mean by colonial times?
Well, I said the socket looked very colonial. That leads me to believe that it was something that was a little bit earlier. You know, keep in mind a lot of the helmet style is very much of a neoclassical, what they call a Miramar type of design that was used by the French soldiers during Napoleon times. And there was 4 styles between 1905 and 1950, and after Waterloo, of course, that didn't exist. It seemed, I would think that Mexico adopted that helmet and used it till 39 when it was made obsolete. Mexico also, what they would do is they would enlist foreign officers to help them design and put together this uniform that was being used. One of the ones that comes to my mind, Carlo Beniski, was an early Iturbide officer that was with General Santana for most of the time, and he had a lot to do with shaping the cavalry into what was in 1836. So it only happens that anything before 1821 is colonial. And I would say that a lot of the colonial designs were sort of were incorporated and were just something that continued on for years afterwards.
Greg Dimick has to leave immediately. He's got to be in a play tonight, and there's a flood between him and the play. And so not only for Greg, but for all of the people, all of our speakers today, would you please give them one more token of your appreciation?